Behind closed doors, a dangerous movement was rising, until a few ordinary people stood up. This is the story they tried to erase. Hit like and subscribe. Now let's begin.
Chapter 1. The Glass House. A reedy and excitable 26-year-old recent Harvard graduate motored through the German countryside, full of He was on his way to an open field in Potsdam to attend a Nazi youth rally, drawn by the chance to see and hear Adolf Hitler in person. Though Hitler was still several months from the chancellorship, he was already the talk of informed Europeans and Americans. For the young American, an aesthete who would one day achieve considerable celebrity himself, there was another draw: the opportunity to witness the dazzling and powerful artifice of a Nazi spectacle up close. This young man had long been a lonely outsider, his life marked by cruel juvenile humor. Frail and a stutterer, he also suffered from a low-grade bipolar disorder called cyclothymia, which had led to nervous breakdowns and slowed his progress. Though he entered Harvard with the class of 1927, he did not graduate until June 1930, 3 years after his classmates. Despite these struggles, he had cultivated the carriage of a man above it all, buoyed by the precepts of his favorite philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche. He embraced Nietzsche's blaring siren song, that the mass of men was a sorry lot, defined by their conformity, but that there existed a small squadron of elites, of demigods, the Übermenschen, who could mold the world because they refused to be bound by convention, morality, or man-made law. Having been raised with what he called rather an upper-class feeling, the Harvard man was not only on the lookout for these rare Übermenschen, but suspected he might one day be counted among them. He masked any feelings of inferiority, as one acquaintance theorized, by being personally aggressive. That day in the fall of 1932, the menacing martial snap and guttural roar of the Potsdam rally became a kind of tent revival for him. It was a political awakening, intensified by the invigorating sight of what he would later recall to his biographer as all those blond boys in black leather parading by. The beefy, baby-faced leader of the Hitler Youth introduced Hitler to a field of 30,000 members of the Jugend in matching brown uniforms and armbands. Pinned to the left breast of the lucky few who could afford it was a weighty metal badge stamped with a swastika and sword. As 50,000 onlookers watched from the overflowing stadium, Hitler took the stage. Children waved hundreds of large Nazi flags, and the crowd roared. He spoke of the need for Germany to feel and act as a nation, for its boys to be proud and defiant, and for its people to be faithful to the fatherland in its time of distress. A reporter noted that the crowd's approval was so thunderous at one point that Hitler had to pause for several minutes before continuing. The young American would later say of that day, "You simply could not fail to be caught up in the excitement of it." He was struck by the notion that Adolf Hitler might just be the Übermensch, the figure destined to reshape politics in Germany and beyond. More than that, he felt that he, Philip Johnson, was somehow destined for a role of his own in this epochal undertaking. Philip Johnson would indeed go on to become a shaper of sorts, one of the world's best-known architects, creating sleek, dark skyscrapers and his unique glass house. He would become a fixture at the power tables of Midtown Manhattan, even helping to design the Four Seasons grill room where he often held court. But all of that was in the future. In 1932, on his return to New York from the Hitler Youth rally that had so stirred his soul, young Philip Johnson's dream was to bring Hitler-style fascism to America. To those who knew him best, Johnson's prospects for leading such a movement seemed exceedingly dim. One admirer recalled him as pulsating with new ideas and hopes, wildly impatient, could not sit down, but also noted that his incessant quickness and vibration could be grating. Others suspected he would be a man without close friends or suitable employment if not for his money. And Philip Johnson had plenty of money. As an undergraduate, his father had gifted him a boatload of preferred stock in the Aluminum Company of America, later Alcoa, which provided an annual dividend income of anywhere from $20,000 to $100,000 in today's dollars. This wealth allowed him to pick up a lot of tabs, which often got him what he wanted. Though not yet a practicing architect, he became a high-wattage popularizer of modern architecture, co-curating and funding groundbreaking shows at the fledgling Museum of Modern Art that introduced Americans to the latest European design. This gave him a platform to celebrate the men he deemed the Übermenschen of architecture, Walter Gropius, Le Corbusier, and Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. He became the head of MoMA's Department of Architecture, in part because he could pay his own salary, as well as those of his personal assistant and the publicity director, Alan Blackburn, a close friend from boarding school and Harvard. While his career in the art world flourished, his efforts to curate American-style fascism did not run as smoothly. In the early 1930s, his life was a whirl of activity, from his museum job and negotiations for a retail concession in Rockefeller Center to his attempts to become an interior designer for the wealthy, and a vibrant social life that included driving up to Harlem for assignations with a beautiful African-American cabaret singer named Jimmy Daniels. At his duplex apartment, which doubled as a showroom for Mies van der Rohe's designs, Johnson and Alan Blackburn would invite friends over to belittle President Roosevelt's New Deal and talk of a day when America would have a bold leader like Hitler. Johnson began compiling a secret list of men and women who seemed sympathetic to an American Hitler, entrusting it to his personal assistant, Ruth Merrill. This new organization was to be called the Gray Shirts, an American counterpart to Hitler's Brown Shirts. The list grew to between 200 and 300 names, but no more than 20 people ever attended a meeting. Merrill, like many who knew Johnson, regarded the entire enterprise as cosplay, overgrown boys in dress-up. She saw Philip as having a weak character and an immature mind, a view widely shared by others who described him as flighty or harmless. The sheriff in his Ohio hometown concluded he was just a man with too much money and time, being a nuisance to himself and everyone else. There was, however, one figure in Johnson's art world circle who was less forgiving, Lincoln Kirstein. Philip's only real passion, Kirstein explained, was to exert power to tell people what they want. Kirstein was in many ways a mirror image of Johnson. He was a contemporary, Harvard-educated, independently wealthy, bisexual, and a budding arts impresario who founded literary magazines and was creating an American ballet troupe to rival Europe's best. But Kirstein was different from Johnson in one very consequential respect. He was Jewish. His father was close friends with Harvard law professor Felix Frankfurter, who was already ringing alarm bells in Washington about the Nazis' brutality. Spending the 1933-34 academic year at Oxford, Frankfurter wrote to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt of the charged atmosphere in Europe and forwarded letters detailing Nazi decrees that made Jews second-class citizens. There is no doubt, Frankfurter wrote in an article, that the Jew in Germany is doomed. Kirstein could sense these ill winds blowing across the Atlantic and into the upper-class salons of Manhattan. At a party one night in 1934, a wealthy socialite, drunk and uninhibited, lashed out a Jewish guest, yelling, "You live on corruption. You all ought to be extirpated." The hostess, distraught, confided in Kirstein the next day, fearful that the ugly scenes from Germany might happen here in America. She later rationalized the outburst, explaining that the woman was overwrought after failing to seduce a man named Lawrence Dennis. It was no surprise to Kirstein that Lawrence Dennis, an enthusiastic pot stirrer, had set the scene in motion. Dennis was a handsome and compelling figure, a Harvard man, a generation older than Johnson and Kirstein, with a mysterious past that included time at the U.S. State Department. A forceful and erudite personality, he had caught the attention of Johnson and Blackburn, who invited him to lecture at the secret meetings of their Gray Shirts. Dennis had invested early in the idea of American-style fascism and relished the prospect of a violent turning of the tables. "I should like nothing better than to be a leader or follower of a Hitler who would crush and destroy many now in power," he wrote to a friend in 1933. He advised Johnson, Blackburn, and their handful of followers that if they wanted a fascist government in America, they would have to play the long game. The best vehicle for that future, Dennis believed, was Huey Long, the recent governor and current U.S. Senator from Louisiana. Smarter than Hitler, Dennis said of Long, adding with characteristic cocksureness, "Long reads my stuff." With the introduction of a seasoned ideologue and a potential political figurehead, the landscape of the narrative shifts. What began as the personal and political awakening of a wealthy, impressionable young man in Potsdam now intersects with a more calculated and dangerous American political current. Philip Johnson's dilettantish foray into fascism, once dismissed by his peers as harmless fantasy, is now guided by a serious theorist who sees a viable path to power, transforming a story of personal obsession into the germination of a genuine movement. Chapter 2. Come to My Feast. By 1934, Huey Long was everywhere, in newspapers, on the radio, in newsreels. In an era of global political extremes and a deepening economic depression, he lurked in the wings of American power, an exemplar of just how far things might go. While America had already replaced the debacle of Herbert Hoover with Franklin Roosevelt's swashbuckling can-do governance, Long presented a bolder vision still. FDR was already radically transforming the economy and the executive branch with a force of will that stunned his opponents. But Long offered a glimpse of what post-democracy strongman rule could look like in the United States. His rise was a uniquely American success story. A governor who became a senator while keeping his old job, who broke the spine of democracy in his state using brass-knuckled bodyguards, engineered kidnappings, and sidestepped impeachments and investigations. Simultaneously cherubic and menacing, he was a populist, a rule breaker, a gifted orator, and a thug who could soak up adoration at a muddy rural rally or in a ballroom of tuxedoed admirers. He once launched an armed invasion of New Orleans using National Guard troops and got away with it, leading one contemporary biographer to subtitle his story, The American Rehearsal for Dictatorship. The nation was living through a moment of tectonic shifts in politics and governance. President Roosevelt's New Deal was just beginning to work its way into society as the federal government, for the first time, used its power to provide emergency relief to the tens of millions whose lives had been destroyed by the stock market crash. To some, this was a dangerous revolution. To others, it was not nearly enough. On the far left fringe, the small but vocal Communist Party of the United States saw the Depression as the final crisis of capitalism prophesied by Marx. They positioned themselves as champions of the marginalized, farm workers, coal miners, and African Americans, agitating for a 40-hour work week, protesting evictions, and financing legal battles like that of the Scottsboro Boys. Yet organized communism was never the force its hysterical critics imagined. The real power lay in the appeal of a proletarian, multiracial American populism, especially one with agrarian roots, during a time of widespread and prolonged economic pain. Huey Long understood this in his bones. He had emerged as President Roosevelt's most talented political antagonist, building a remarkable grassroots movement he called Share Our Wealth. Its platform was as simple and direct as a biblical edict. None shall be too rich and none shall be too poor. Speaking to a national audience on the NBC radio network, Long promised a land where the fruits of the nation were shared by all. He offered concrete policies to achieve this: a guaranteed monthly pension for the elderly, a guaranteed college education for all who desired it, and a guaranteed family income. The plan to pay for it was just as simple: take the money from where it was stashed. He pointed out that less than 2% of Americans hoarded more than 60% of the nation's wealth. He called for an exponential federal tax on accumulated fortunes, proposing to cap individual family wealth at a level, whether $5 million or $50 million was a malleable detail, that would strip them down to frying size. Long had a genius for painting down-home word pictures to explain the national economy. The Lord, he insisted, had called a barbecue for 125 million Americans, but Morgan, Rockefeller, and Mellon had waltzed up and taken 85% of the victuals off the table. It was a red-hot message in the depths of the Depression. By the end of its first year, Long's Share Our Wealth Society had nearly 8 million members in over 25,000 local clubs across America. Unlike most populists, the Kingfish, as he liked to be called, had a track record. In 6.5 years, he had delivered to Louisiana thousands of miles of paved roads, dozens of bridges, free textbooks for schools, free night schools that taught over 100,000 adults to read, and state hospitals open to all. He forced the repeal of the poll tax, increasing voter registration by 76% in a single year, and raised taxes on the powerful oil companies. The bare truth behind this miracle, however, was that he had accomplished it by effectively dismantling democracy. He brought the entire state under the control of his political machine, stacking every level of government with loyalists. He ran Louisiana like a mob boss, using bribes and threats to get what he wanted, and demanding tribute from every official who owed him their job. Credible accusations of kidnapping and attempted murder never stuck. He had the police and prosecutors sewn up tight. "I am the Constitution," he once said. "There may be smarter men than me, but they ain't in Louisiana." For an observer like Lawrence Dennis, Long's progressive economics were merely a sideshow. While a less cynical man might see a figure of the left, Dennis saw the proof for his book, The Coming American Fascism. Here was a man harnessing the discontent of the people to make himself an all-powerful figure, a man with the skills and the clear intention to end America's Republican form of government. Dennis noted Long's gleeful grave digging for democratic norms and his effective use of optics, traveling with a phalanx of uniformed guards and menacing skull crushers. Long's limitless appetite for authority was on full display. "A perfect democracy," Long told a reporter, "can come close to looking like a dictatorship." To interested readers like Philip Johnson, Dennis explained that control of a state provided funds, taxing power, and most crucially, an armed militia. The key to taking a nation, just as Lenin had triumphed by capturing the loyalty of the troops. Near the end of 1934, Philip Johnson's life in New York was becoming wobbly. His lover, Jimmy Daniels, had left him for a wealthier man. His interior decorating business was failing, and his sway at the Museum of Modern Art was waning, in part because Lincoln Kirstein was warning trustees that the museum was in danger of being tarred with the fascist brush. The timing was perfect for Johnson to fall headlong under the ideological spell of Huey Long. With Dennis's words in his ear, Johnson could conjure a Hitlerian Potsdam scene shimmering to life on the American horizon. He began speaking to friends of when the revolution comes, imagining himself as one of Long's key brain trusters, or, at his most manic, as the American Hitler who would eventually depose Long and seize control of the country for himself. Just before the winter solstice, Johnson and Alan Blackburn summoned a reporter from the New York Herald Tribune to their MoMA office. They announced they were taking a sabbatical to start the National Party and were leaving the next day for Louisiana to sign on Huey Long as their leader. Their platform consisted entirely of direct action and more emotionalism, and their slogan was, "The need is for one party." While leafing through firearms catalogs, Johnson explained that they wanted followers with the courage and loyalty of gangsters like John Dillinger and Al Capone. The following day, the two 20-somethings attached their new flying wedge pennants to Johnson's 12-cylinder Packard, loaded it with volumes of Shakespeare, Machiavelli, and Dennis, and headed south. Lincoln Kirstein was not unhappy to see them go. His ability to find humor in their fascist buccaneering had vanished after a recent confrontation. He had stopped by their office to needle them by announcing his new membership in the Communist Party, and Blackburn had threatened to have him beaten up. Kirstein laughed it off at the time, but he could not shake Johnson's parting remark. For years, he would remember the chilling words, "He told me I was number one on his list for elimination in the coming revolution." The journey from the rally at Potsdam to the open road to Louisiana marked a chilling evolution. What had begun as an abstract, aesthetic fascination with power had now found a concrete vehicle and a sinister new purpose. Johnson's political theater, once dismissed by his peers as a harmless affectation, had curdled into a genuine and personal menace, setting the stage for a darker and more desperate chapter in his pursuit of an American Übermensch. Chapter 3. Umwege. In 1933, for a young-to-be, as the Nazis worked to make daily life intolerable for German Jews, their plan was twofold: to generate a culture of menacing intimidation while also drafting civil and criminal codes that would place all persons of Jewish heritage outside the protections of the state. For this latter goal, a particular foreign country offered a roadmap. And so, the German Foreign Office dispatched a young man named Heinrich Krieger to the University of Arkansas School of Law. The reality, as historian James Q. Whitman would later write, is that the Nazis took a sustained and sometimes eager interest in the American example of race law, regarding the United States as the innovative world leader in its creation. This would have been no surprise to African Americans living under Jim Crow, nor to the readers of the Pittsburgh Courier, which in 1933 ran an editorial titled, "Hitler Learns from America." Young Krieger quickly saw how the United States could provide a conceptual prototype. In his carrel at the Fayetteville Law Library, he had a catbird seat for studying the finely crafted statutory racial hierarchy of more than 30 states whose laws forced Black Americans into second-class citizenship. He also studied federal laws governing immigration and the treatment of people in America's new territorial acquisitions. In the book that grew from his research, Krieger argued that race protection had always been a crucial motivator in America's tiered system of justice. He was not alone in this assessment. A long line of revered American statesmen had admitted as much. Theodore Roosevelt, for instance, saw white Americans and white Germans as allies in a war between the races. He praised the democratic policy that kept the Chinaman out of America and Australia, securing the temperate zones as a heritage for the white people. In his view, the white triumph over the native population, whom he described as living an existence less meaningful than that of wild beasts, was a crowning achievement of civilization. Hitler, too, would take note of this, remarking that Americans had gunned down the millions of redskins to a few 100,000 and now kept the remnant under observation in a cage. As president, Roosevelt harangued white Americans about the perils of race suicide, badgering white women to have more pure white babies in what he called the warfare of the cradle. But he was just one standout in a long line of U.S. presidents. Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln had both expressed a desire to see all people of African descent shipped overseas. More recently, Woodrow Wilson had resegregated the federal workforce, and Calvin Coolidge had signed radical restrictions on immigration, writing in Good Housekeeping that such laws were a necessary step in walling off white America from the vicious, the weak of body, the shiftless, or the improvident. Biological laws, Coolidge wrote, tell us that certain divergent people will not mix or blend. The architect of these restrictions, a wealthy eugenicist, would later lead the charge to block Jewish refugees from entering America during the war. For Heinrich Krieger, the central tension in American life and law was how to legally privilege white men as a ruling race in a country whose constitution explicitly guaranteed equal protection to all. He discovered the genius of the American system was its use of juridical Umwege, secret, twisting passageways of legal reasoning that circumvented this contradiction. Unlike the mechanical civil law system in Germany, the American common law tradition gave judges more room to maneuver. On matters of race, Krieger explained to his Nazi cohorts The American system was a bouillabaisse of artificial line drawing, illogic, and incoherence. Exhibit A was the Supreme Court's decisions in the insular cases following the Spanish-American War. Faced with governing new territories inhabited by brown-skinned people, the court simply opined that the Constitution did not fully apply. These alien races belonged to the United States but were not a part of it. As one German legal scholar noted, if you allowed the Umwege to work on you, American race law's secret passageways could lead beyond the text of the law and into the more expansive vaults of intuition. In other words, Americans had found a way to leave egalitarian language on the books while interpreting it to justify any policy that just felt right. The Nazis were in love with the idea. Krieger's research proved most useful to the Nazi Ministry of Justice, which sought to criminalize Jewishness itself. American laws concerning Native Americans, immigration, and Jim Crow were all based on the idea that the superior white race must be walled off and protected. With this as the starting assumption, one could Umwege their way through any legal dispute to encode racial superiority into the law. America offered countless examples of how to do it. The constitutional promise of equal protection yielded easily to the imperative of race protection. Interracial marriage, for example, was a criminal offense in much of the country, enforced in the well-understood spirit of protecting whiteness from genetic incursion. The law's assurance of equal protection was simply ignored. This was the template. As one German expert noted in 1934, American race legislation was based absolutely certainly on the idea of the inferiority of the other race. The American experience had given Nazi lawyers a great jumping-off point. What followed was the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, passed in September 1935, which forbade marriage or sexual relations between Jews and Germans. 2 months later, a second law stripped Jews of their citizenship and political rights. At that same session, the Reichstag made another notable move. It formally adopted the swastika as the official symbol of the new Germany. The United States figured in this decision as well. In July of that year, the new German ocean liner SS Bremen had docked in New York, flying an outsized swastika. A crowd of nearly 2,000 New Yorkers gathered to protest. The melee turned violent, and 5 protesters managed to board the ship, haul down the flag, and toss it into the Hudson River. German officials were incensed. The U.S. State Department offered its regrets. The Germans were even more livid when a New York City magistrate, Judge Louis B. Brodsky, released the protesters and used the occasion to lecture Hitler, calling the swastika a black flag of piracy and an emblem of a revolt against civilization. In response, the Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels confided to his diary, "Our answer, in Nuremberg the Reichstag will meet and declare the swastika flag to be our sole national flag." In his Nuremberg speech, Hitler thanked the Roosevelt administration for its decent and honorable handling of the matter, while also warning that if international Jewish agitation did not cease, the laws in the Reich might become even harsher. This unexpected detour into the legal underpinnings of racial ideology reveals a startling truth that complicates the entire narrative. While Philip Johnson and his compatriots were looking to Germany for a political model to import, the architects of the Third Reich were looking to America for the legal framework to justify their own atrocities. The journey to bring fascism to America is now shadowed by the revelation that some of its most potent legal tools were in fact American-made. The search for an American Hitler is thus cast in a new, more troubling light, suggesting that the foundations for such a figure were not something to be imported, but had been deeply embedded in the nation's own history and legal traditions all along. Chapter 4. Louisiana was not quite ready. The Hitler-adoring would-be fascist aesthete Philip Johnson arrived in Louisiana's capital swelled with youthful imaginings. In the first days of 1935, as Nazis in Germany were still working out their initial anti-Semitic laws, Johnson and his lackey, Alan Blackburn, nosed their National Party pennant-flying Packard into Baton Rouge. Full of big dreams, they hoped to hitch their wagon to the shooting star of American politics, Senator Huey Long, who was already making noise about challenging Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the next year's presidential election. Johnson was convinced that Long would immediately recognize their talents. They were Harvard men, after all, capable of writing political speeches. They could art direct stylish pamphlets just as they had for the international style of architecture. They could even create the stages and backdrops for Long's immense political rallies, having seen the nuts and bolts of such awe-inspiring sets firsthand in Potsdam. The problem was, they couldn't get an audience. In 1935, Huey Long was pretty much unreachable. It wasn't that Johnson didn't know where Long was. From anywhere in Baton Rouge, one could see the beacon of light glowing 24 stories high atop the Art Deco Capitol that Long himself had funded. Though now a senator in Washington, D.C., he still kept a top floor as his personal apartments, an Olympian altitude that he claimed set him above the pollen and dust. When the Kingfish did emerge, however, he was surrounded by an ever-growing cadre of armed men, a scene that screamed dictator in any language. His protection detail had grown from a single state trooper to at least a dozen, supplemented by civilian toughs. This personal army was amply, if not uniformly, armed. One man had a .38 caliber Colt, another carried a pistol and a blackjack, and a third sported a snub-nosed revolver and, on occasion, a sawed-off shotgun concealed in a paper bag. These musclemen were not merely for show. Their violence was often directed at reporters from what Long called the Leah newspapers. When a photographer named Leon Trice snapped a picture of Long bickering in the Capitol lobby, Huey's enforcers sucker-punched him and threw him down a flight of marble stairs. Long reportedly stood by laughing as the man's head bounced down the steps. Months later, after Johnson's arrival, Trice took another innocuous photo of Long in New Orleans. One of the bodyguards, Joe Messina, rushed the slender photographer, slugging him in the face and then beating him with a blackjack after he had fallen. The attack was so brutal that Messina was charged with assault with intent to murder. This motley cohort stood guard as the boss prowled the legislative floor, buttonholing lawmakers and demanding they pass his bills. When one such bill transferred all authority of New Orleans to Long's political machine and his puppet governor, it gave him control over thousands of patronage jobs and a huge new haul of kickbacks. The bodyguards were a constant presence. Whether Long was being fitted for custom silk suits, holding court at the Roosevelt Hotel bar, or accepting sacks full of cash from his key bagman, Seymour Weiss, in exchange for state contracts. Philip Johnson, knowing little of political mechanics, intuited that a direct approach would be unwise. He and Blackburn never got an audience on their first tour of Baton Rouge. Undeterred, they followed the Kingfish's train north to Washington, D.C., and took rooms in the same hotel where the senator liked to meet foreign dignitaries in his purple silk pajamas. But despite their fealty, Long had no use for them. He was already long on bootlickers and flush with money. When a meeting was finally granted, it went nowhere. Long's team dismissed Johnson's ideas about new communications technology and his amateurish speechwriting. A vaguely substantive meeting with Long's personal secretary crystallized the issue. Decades later, Johnson would still shake his head remembering the encounter. An actual practitioner of power politics was not interested in rhetoric, art direction, or pseudo-fascist theory. One of Senator Long's people said to me, Johnson recalled, "How many votes do you control?" The answer, 2, perhaps a dozen other gray shirts in New York City, exposed them as pikers, fascists manqué with no notion of what it took to accrue real power. Johnson, unsurprisingly, saw the shortcoming as Long's, not his own. He was so individual and chaotic that there was no way of getting along, Johnson said. By the summer of 1935, having ceased to follow Long around like excited puppies. Johnson and Blackburn were still paying close attention to the press coverage. They were pleased to see Long hinting at a third-party presidential run, a move they figured would split the Democratic vote, deny Roosevelt re-election, and create a political free-for-all ripe for exploitation. Long himself seemed to be sowing chaos, jamming through a bill that would make it a crime for federal officers to exercise authority in Louisiana, a bold defiance of the U.S. government. Then, on September 9, 1935, the newspapers carried dramatic bulletins for an entirely different reason. The night before, Huey Long had been gut-shot in the rotunda of the Louisiana state capitol. The initial reports were odd and alarming. The assailant was an apolitical doctor, the bullet had missed all major organs, and after an operation to stop the hemorrhaging, Long's team insisted he would pull through. So the general public, and Philip Johnson among them, was completely unprepared for the next day's news. Senator Huey Long, the ruler of Louisiana and would-be ruler of the United States, had died of his wounds. His funeral drew more than 100,000 admirers to Baton Rouge, who waited in the boiling heat for a glimpse of his coffin. The featured speaker, Reverend Gerald L. K. Smith, a talented orator in his own right, told the overheated crowd that Long died for us, and that his final prayer was, "Oh God, don't let me die. I have a few more things to do." Observers were divided on how to sum up his life. He was deeply corrupt, yet he was also a champion of the have-nots who built roads, schools, and hospitals, and confronted economic injustice head-on. By chance, his death occurred the same week the Reichstag enacted the Nuremberg laws, and the German Führer was also on the front pages. The comparison was unavoidable. As one columnist wrote, Huey was gradually copying the Hitler state, but Louisiana was not quite ready for blood purges and internment camps. The abrupt and violent end of Huey Long's career also marked the end of Johnson's first naive foray into American fascism. The man he had chosen as his vehicle for revolution was gone, leaving behind a legacy as complex and contradictory as the nation itself. The dream of an American Hitler, which had seemed so tangible just months before, dissolved in a Baton Rouge hospital, leaving Johnson to recalibrate his ambitions in a political landscape suddenly devoid of its most chaotic and charismatic force. Chapter 5. He had a very high opinion of me. On the afternoon of September 8, 1936, uniformed youth, soldiers, and the ubiquitous brown shirts. Making its debut was the 25,000-man Schutzstaffel, the SS, drawing attention in menacing jet-black uniforms, on hand for crowd control and general-use head-cracking. The medieval city teemed with newcomers, its streets filled with marching troops and Hitler Youth, creating what one American newspaperman described as a mass hysteria that hypnotized participants and spectators alike. As the bell signaled Hitler's arrival, a sea of Nazis washed toward City Hall. In the crowd, a fascist-leaning American history professor caught sight of a tall, square-jawed compatriot, Lawrence Dennis, striding through the streets before being lost in the throng. At that moment, as his biographer would later write, America's most outspoken fascist symbolically melted into the Nazi mass. While his ideological guru was being welcomed into the engine room of the global fascist enterprise, Philip Johnson, left leaderless by Huey Long's death, was adrift 4,500 miles away in Chicago. Dennis, however, was an honored guest in Nuremberg, one of a few hundred foreign dignitaries and thought leaders the Nazis had deemed sympathetic enough to invite for an inside view. He was already well known to the German embassy in Washington, where officials kept a growing file of clippings by and about the erudite American. His biography alone was full of possibility. He had spent his youth in Europe, was fluent in French and German, and was a graduate of Phillips Exeter and Harvard. He counted a son of Theodore Roosevelt and Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. among his acquaintances. After nearly a decade as a diplomat in the revolutionary hotspots of Latin America, he had left the State Department in a huff, leaning into the role of a mordant social critic. He took a cynical scythe to American sweet talk about democracy, arguing that nations like Nicaragua needed sanitation and economic structure, not fair elections exported in a soldier's knapsack. By 1930, he had turned full-time to writing political treatises, cultivating a reputation as a fearless champion of European-style fascism as the preferred next step for American governance. By the time of the rally, his file at the German embassy was bulging with reviews of his latest book, The Coming American Fascism. As one reporter noted, until Mr. Dennis arrived on scene, American fascism did not have a prophet. The special summons to Nuremberg was the cherry on top of a months-long sojourn in Europe in the summer of 1936, where Dennis had been received and celebrated by elites across the continent. He bragged that the economist John Maynard Keynes had a very high opinion of me and had invited him to lunch. He claimed similar admiration from the British leftist John Strachey. He met with government officials in Paris, was shown around Moscow by a young George Kennan, and was granted a private hour-long meeting in Rome with Mussolini. But all of that paled in comparison to Nuremberg. This was where the real action was, where the world will be told where it gets off, as he wrote to his wife, Eleanor. From their farmhouse in Massachusetts, she tracked his journey, gushing in a letter, "When this reaches you, you will be in Deutschland. Be nice to all the Germans for me, and especially to those brave women who are making babies for Hitler." While in Europe, Dennis, supported in part by occasional checks from Philip Johnson, missed the birth of his second daughter. This detachment was part of a persona Dennis cultivated. His blunt, bitter tone and unapologetic embrace of cruelty were central to his appeal as fascism's leading American spokesman. He was a man cloaking deep insecurity with an armor of certitude, name-dropping, and elitism. The gimlet-eyed Anne Morrow Lindbergh, a fellow Nazi sympathizer, spent hours in his company and sensed a man who had been badly hurt, leaving him with a curious downward pout, like the terrible mouths of the Greek masks for tragedy, and with no love of mankind as such. Dennis himself put it more simply. "We aren't concerned with moral issues," he explained in a debate. "The idea of fascism is to make the show run." That a great many people might get chewed up in the machinery was either beside the point, or exactly the point. The Nazi conclave in Nuremberg was designed to show the world just how powerful that machinery had become. In his opening speech, Hitler declared that Germany had shaken off the slavery of the Treaty of Versailles and been resurrected. The totality of this newfound power was on display all week. The reconstituted German Luftwaffe, 400 weaponized airships in all, appeared without warning in the skies. On the final day, squadrons of planes performed choreographed dives before a gaggle of fighters scudded over the crowd in a swastika formation. Tens of thousands of soldiers, cavalry, and tanks then rushed a parade ground in a mock battle. "The future belongs to the brave alone." Hitler's voice cut through the smoke-filled air. The spectacle was not lost on the international press, which reported on the stunning conviction of Germany's unequaled strength. The Nazis were clear about where this firepower was aimed: at the communist scourge, those Bolshevist Jews. Anti-Semitism was hotter and meaner than ever in Germany that summer, with talk of new laws to forbid Jews from owning private property, and a clear shift from bullying them to leave towards something far more menacing. Lawrence Dennis got a close look at it all, invited into the Nazi family circle. He was given a minder, a protege of Joseph Goebbels, and a small team of uniformed stormtroopers who escorted him through a daily schedule of meals and meetings. He even had a brief private interview with the Führer, whom he found unimpressive up close, a man of instinct and showmanship. Still, Dennis saw there was something to be learned from Hitler's dark art of uniting a people against a set of invented enemies. He found the other top Nazis, like Goebbels and Goering, to be more to his liking, thinking men, even intellectuals. At one point, Dennis suggested to them that their overt treatment of the Jews looked bad and was not advancing their critical mission of keeping America out of a war in Europe. To strip Jews of citizenship and property rights, he advised, they didn't need laws that came right out and said it. "Why don't you treat the Jews more or less as we treat the Negroes in America?" he asked. The Nazi response was direct. "You Americans mind your own business and we'll mind ours," they told him. "You leave ours alone, we'll leave yours alone." Years later, Dennis would recall his reaction. "Of course," he explained, "I couldn't strongly disagree with that." Having left Philip Johnson leaderless in America, the prophet of American fascism had journeyed to the heart of the Nazi regime, not as a critic, but as a consultant. His travels, which began with the search for an American Hitler, ended in Nuremberg, where he offered tactical advice on persecution, drawing on his own country's long and troubled history. The ideological circle was now complete, with the American student of European fascism offering his own nation's racial sins as a model for a more subtle and perhaps more insidious form of oppression. Chapter 6: Bullet Holes. While his ideological mentor was being feted in Nuremberg, Philip Johnson was in Chicago, still adrift he had designed in his head as Tague sketched it to life. It was to be a massive platform, a bright white backdrop 40 feet wide and 28 feet high, with a narrow stage. 10 feet above that, a small pulpit, big enough for just one man, would appear to be floating in midair, high above the audience. At the top, 7 pairs of sturdy brackets would hold enormous American flags, built to withstand the strongest winds off Lake Michigan. Tague, like others in the small community of modern architecture, knew of Johnson's reputation as an ultra-right zealot and had a good idea who this dramatic platform was for. After the assassination of Huey Long had thwarted his Louisiana sojourn, Johnson had gone to work for Father Charles Coughlin, the radio priest, with a national audience in the tens of millions. The shift made perfect sense. Coughlin had been one of Long's crucial allies in a planned third-party run against Roosevelt, and the two men shared an economic program that leaned on government control and the vilification of bankers. Coughlin was a loose cannon, which was precisely what drew Johnson's interest. He seemed the most dynamic populist at the time, Johnson later said. By the summer of 1936, the stout, combustible priest had begun a national speaking tour opposing Roosevelt's re-election, calling the president a betrayer and a liar who was handing the country over to the communists. Johnson's grand platform was for Coughlin's upcoming Labor Day rally in Chicago. The project was proof that Johnson was, at long last, making a vital contribution. After Long's death, he and Alan Blackburn had struggled. Following the advice of one of Long's aides, Johnson had taken his banner-waving Packard to his hometown of New London, Ohio, and entered the primary for a state legislature seat. On the strength of his family's sterling reputation, his father was a local hero. He won with ease. But as the town became reacquainted with the younger Johnson, he quickly wore out his welcome. Filthy rich, without a job or any background in governance, he behaved, a la Nietzsche, as one of the favored few, endeavoring to decimate the policies of this town without consent or approval of anyone other than himself. By June 1936, Johnson and New London were fed up with each other. He abandoned the campaign and put his shoulder to the wheel of Father Coughlin's battle royale against FDR. Johnson envisioned the Chicago event as a recreation of the Nazi pageantry he had witnessed in Potsdam 4 years earlier. He arranged for police escorts with sirens blasting and had a 60-foot-high photograph of Father Coughlin erected. The crowd was immense, estimated by reporters at nearly 150,000. But beyond the impressive size, Johnson's design tableau was a wan imitation of its inspiration. Unlike the tightly controlled settings of Nuremberg, the periphery of Chicago's Riverview Park was impossible to hide. Visible beyond the massive platform were dark netting from a golf driving range, telephone wires, and uninspiring water tanks and smokestacks. The Keck-built drywall podium, as big as it was, ended up dwarfed by the competing urban landscape. When Coughlin ascended to his floating pulpit, he looked not massive and monolithic, but like an ineffectual speck, his little hands impotently cutting the air. Johnson's first fascist building project was, visually, a failure. The crowd, too, was exceedingly ordinary. Men in shirt sleeves, women in summer dresses. There were no uniforms, no geometrically pleasing rows, no squadrons of fighter planes in swastika formation. This was not the rally of all those blond boys in black leather. The rally's ostensible purpose was for Coughlin to speak on behalf of his presidential candidate, William Liberty Bill Lemke, a no-account congressman from North Dakota, chosen to lead the ticket of the newly formed Union Party. The candidacy was merely a vehicle for the Canadian-born Coughlin, who was unable to run himself. Hanging a microphone from his chest, the priest assailed President Roosevelt and his Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins, whom he called the Madam Perkins, with her three-corner hat, one corner for communism, one for socialism, and one for Americanism. When he asked who in the crowd would vote against Roosevelt, a roar of "no" thundered across the field. Coughlin could certainly move a crowd, but that power proved to be non-transferable. Lemke's campaign was an abject failure. As it went from obvious to embarrassing, Coughlin's rhetoric grew more desperate and dangerous. If Roosevelt were reelected, he reportedly warned, there would be more bullet holes in the White House than you could count with an adding machine. His final pronouncement left no room for ambiguity. Democracy is doomed, Coughlin said. This is our last election. It is fascism or communism. We are at a crossroads. I take the road to fascism. The aesthetic spectacle so carefully imported from Nazi Germany had failed to take root in the messy reality of a Chicago park, leaving Johnson's artistic ambitions unfulfilled. Yet the ideological core of the movement he had joined was hardening. The failure of the ballot box was giving way to the threat of the bullet, and the movement's leader, having failed to create a political alternative, was now openly declaring his allegiance to a more destructive path, dragging his followers, including Philip Johnson, along with him. Chapter 7. Silver Shirts. The same week that Lawrence Dennis was melting into the Nazi masses at Nuremberg and Father Coughlin was on designing banners, this group appeared to have numbers and momentum. Severay decided to go undercover. A striking, sinewy young man who knew his way around a hunting rifle, with a face weathered by the winds of his native North Dakota, he appeared to be just the sort of person who would bring credit to their cause. His own worldview, shaped by a conservative, small-town upbringing, put him at ease with the older white Protestants who filled the silver shirt rosters, and they were at ease with him. He had little trouble winning their confidence, and they soon invited him into their middle-class parlors, pulling the lace curtains tight to read him into their plans. The group was organized into councils of safety, and while Severay couldn't get a master list of names, he got ballpark numbers, almost 500 members in the 5th Congressional District alone, and around 6,000 statewide. Their mission was disquieting. This was not a service club, but a group of vigilantes gearing up for a quasi-religious, violent crusade. One retired businessman showed Severay his cupboards, stocked with canned goods for the day of the communist uprising, and declared with a quivering finger that he was ready to die as a martyr, defending his wife to the end. They were quite mad, Severay remembered. This fever dream was fueled by a secret society phobia. The members saw themselves as a select few to whom a fearsome truth had been revealed. A dastardly conspiracy of international Jewry had infiltrated the highest levels of the American government. President Roosevelt's real name, they insisted, was Rosenfeld. They trafficked in the anti-Semitic poison of texts like the protocols of the meetings of the learned elders of Zion, and learned from their weekly newsletter the definition of a new vocabulary word, pogrom. The young reporter took them at their word and took them seriously. His hard-boiled city editor, however, was not convinced, not until he attended a meeting for himself and returned to the office yelling, "Get me a drink quick! God, I feel I've been through the most fantastic nightmare of my life." Even then, the editor hesitated to publish, counseled by local Jewish leaders who feared that dragging the group into the open would only abet a virulent anti-Semitism. But Severay held his ground. These people were a serious threat, and readers needed to understand the danger. All of these Midwestern bourgeois, he wrote, worshipped one man, William Dudley Pelley. To his followers, Severay explained, Pelley is the coming savior for the nation. They believe he is the man to do what Hitler has done in Germany. Where the intellectual Lawrence Dennis masked his grievances in scholarly theorizing, Pelley was fearless in weaponizing his own compulsive resentments. Born into a poor, deeply religious New England household, he grew into a man with a flair for the dramatic and a talent for storytelling, finding success writing short stories and screenplays for early movie stars like Lon Chaney and Mary Astor. But a career as a movie mogul or publishing magnate never panned out, and he soured, becoming a lone wolf at life, getting the least bit mangy as I reached my 40s. Around 1930, he hit on a new vein of commerce, a combination of charismatic Christianity and the occult. He claimed to have had a near-death experience, which he described in cinematic detail in a popular magazine, and 2 other spectral visitations that left him in possession of the answers to the mystery of life. He was, he told his millions of readers, a man reborn. Then he cooked up a more dramatic twist. He was a human radio receiver, able to tune in on the minds and voices of those in another dimension of being, taking dictation for hours from the learned souls of the 4th dimension. His first attempt to monetize this new gift, a venture in Asheville, North Carolina, called Galahad College, foundered in a flash. Pelley seemed destined for the long line of forgotten American charlatans until 1933, when he hooked his psychic claptrap scheme onto the most dynamic political movement in the world. He claimed his ethereal interlocutors had revealed the coming of this new epoch to him years earlier. On the very day Hitler came to power in Germany, Pelley came out from undercover with his Silver Shirts national organization. He understood that while love and harmony were nice, for pure motive force, hate trumps. His weekly newspaper, the Silver Legion Ranger, gave readers someone to hate, the Jews, who were busy with a vast and secret plan for world domination. An insane number of Americans signed right up for his call to Christian soldiers. For their dues, they received a silver shirt with a great scarlet L over the heart and were instructed to keep arms and be ready to bear them. Pelley, meanwhile, watched Hitler's rise with solipsistic interest. Read Hitler's autobiography, he would tell his aides, and then compare it with my life and note the similarities between us. He ran a bizarre, muddle-headed campaign for the presidency in 1936, always armed and in military regalia, surrounded by a squadron of bodyguards that would have made Huey Long blush. He promised to rid America of the Jewish Bolshevist communists and establish a new order with himself, the chief, in charge of a nation of white Christian stockholders. You probably won't believe this story was the lead on Arnold Severide's series, which debuted on the front page of the Minneapolis Journal on September 11, 1936. The editors, however, had toned it down, presenting it as a semi-humorous expose of ridiculous crackpots. The series even included the Silver Shirts prophecy, drawn from the pyramids of Giza, that the Jews would seize control of the world on September 16th. The day passed without incident, but the letdown did nothing to diminish the apocalyptic ardor of Pelley's followers. The fear and hatred were now turned on Severide, who received so many threats that his brothers showed up at his apartment with guns to protect him. He waved them off, believing the men were too chicken-hearted to make a real attack. Here, however, Severide might have underestimated the ugly truth. His window into the movement was confined to middle-class parlors where Pelley's Weekly sat next to the King James Bible. He did not know that on September 17th, an FBI report detailed a Silver Shirt field marshal's attempt to buy 15,000 rounds of automatic ammunition and high-caliber rifles for Pelley's private army. Nor did he know that an associate of Pelley's was telling fellow fascists that a day of pogrom was coming, that Father Coughlin would soon let loose on the Jews, and that this same man had recently filed a patent for a new weapon he called the Kike Killer. While Johnson's aesthetic fascism and Coughlin's electoral gambit had both fizzled, a third, more virulent strain of the movement had been quietly taking root in the heartland. Seemingly disparate and led by a man dismissed as a crackpot, it was not concerned with stages or speeches, but with stockpiling weapons and preparing for a holy war. The threat was not a charismatic demagogue hijacking the state, but a network of true believers arming themselves for a bloody, apocalyptic battle of their own making. Chapter 8, Tikkun Olam. The Kike Killer was never mass-produced, but on Friday, April 22, 1938, one homegrown fascists of Southern California. They carried boxes of anti-Semitic handbills to the roofs of 4 downtown buildings and, right on schedule, released them. Thousands of flyers drifted down onto the crowded streets below. Allen deemed the exploit a success. None of the 4 snowmen made it back to the Studebaker. Someone had dropped a dime on them, and they were arrested for violating the city's anti-handbill ordinance. But Allen was held on a more serious charge, possession of a deadly weapon. The informant had not only given the police advance warning of the snowstorm, but had also provided specific intelligence about the Oak Club hanging in Allen's car, a weapon he called a kite killer. The cops confiscated it and impounded the Studebaker. When Allen's aide, Charles Slocum, raced back to Pasadena to alert Allen's wife, Pearl, she became uncharacteristically flustered. "There are papers in that briefcase no one is supposed to see," she told Slocum, referring to a briefcase inside the seized car. She immediately alerted someone known only as Auntie, the reputed brains and cash behind the Southern California fascist movement, who ordered Slocum to get back to San Diego and secure the briefcase at all costs. Charles Slocum did just as he was told, after a fashion. First thing the next morning, Slocum was barreling back down the coast highway, but his companion on the ride, his real boss, was even more anxious to get to San Diego. Leon Lewis was not an excitable man, but for 5 years he had been nurturing a secret spy ring out of his small Los Angeles law office, dedicated to blowing the Nazi movement in America to smithereens. This was the mission he had been preparing for most of his life. The son of Jewish immigrants from Germany, he had come of age in small-town Middle America, fluent in English, German, and Yiddish, and devoted to the Jewish concept of tikkun olam, world repair. His journey began at the Anti-Defamation League, which was founded after the 1915 lynching of a Jewish factory executive in Atlanta. After serving in counterintelligence during World War I, Lewis returned to an America where anti-Semitism was on the rise, with an unmistakable Exhibit A, Henry Ford. The celebrated industrialist freely spewed his rank, unchecked anti-Semitism, whining about Wall Street kikes, and even ordering the brass removed from his Model T, calling it Jew metal. Using his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, Ford launched a 92-part series based on the protocols of the meetings of the Learned Elders of Zion, a fraudulent Russian pamphlet detailing a fictitious plot for Jewish world domination. The series was published in 4 volumes as The International Jew, distributed in 4 dealerships across the country, and translated and published worldwide, including in Germany, where it landed in the hands of a particularly gifted propagandist. Adolf Hitler extolled Ford by name in Mein Kampf, and when a reporter visited his Munich office in 1931, she found a large, framed portrait of America's most famous anti-Semite hanging on the wall. "I regard Henry Ford as my inspiration," Hitler explained. When asked why he was anti-Semitic, he replied without hesitation, "Somebody has to be blamed for our troubles." When Hitler came to power in 1933, Leon Lewis recognized the danger immediately. That spring, a Nazi captain arrived on the Pacific coast to organize the Friends of New Germany, holding their first open meeting in Los Angeles. They announced they would save America from its 2 greatest enemies, Jews and communists, and they began offering food and housing to down-and-out World War I veterans, the same blueprint Hitler had used to build his brown shirt army. Lewis saw what was happening. "They're trying to raise an army here," he realized. They were preparing for Der Tag, the day they would take over America. Lewis decides, as historian Stephen Ross writes, "Well, I need to do something." What he did was incredible and incredibly dangerous. He recruited a small group of disgruntled non-Jewish American veterans, the same pool the Nazis were after, and turned them into spies. Many were German American, and some were combat wounded. Lewis had helped them pro bono, and now they were willing to return the favor. They infiltrated the Friends of New Germany clubhouse, a bustling hub with a beer garden and an Aryan bookstore that sold Mein Kampf and a growing assortment of American-produced anti-Semitic literature. The operation made quick work, identifying key players in the movement, uncovering direct support from the German government, and scuttling plots, including a scheme to take over U.S. military armories on the West Coast. But when Lewis took his evidence, sworn affidavits, secret recordings, to law enforcement, he was met with indifference and hostility. The LAPD chief, Two Gun Davis, told him the real threat was not fascists, but all those communists in Boyle Heights. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, was obsessively focused on the same communist threat. Congress conducted a secret investigation but buried the findings to avoid ruffling feathers in Berlin. The pressure was immense. Lewis's first spy suffered a debilitating nervous breakdown. His successor, Charles Slocum, a former police informant inside the KKK who hated bigots and loved adventure, burrowed deeper. He helped check some of the nastiest plots, including a plan to hang a dozen prominent Jewish men, including Busby Berkeley, from oak trees in a secluded park. The plot was taken over by Henry Allen and a wild-eyed anti-Semite named Leopold McLaglen, who expanded the list of victims to include Jack Benny and Samuel Goldwyn, and made plans for firebombings and dynamiting steamships carrying fleeing Jews. At the end of 1937, Lewis and Slocum, with help from naval intelligence, found a way to have McLaglen arrested and deported. By that Saturday in April 1938, as they sped toward San Diego, McLaglen was gone and Allen was in jail. Their priority was the briefcase. They suspected it held a bonanza of new evidence, perhaps revealing the role of Auntie, whom they believed to be Leslie Fry, the woman who had sent the protocols to Henry Ford 2 decades earlier. They had little hope of getting help from the local police, who were openly sympathetic to Allen. "Hell," one cop had said, "they ought to give him a medal." Remarkably, however, the district attorney and sheriff had the briefcase and allowed them a look inside. It was a mass of correspondence exposing widespread fascist conspiracies and close affiliation with Nazi leaders. Lewis begged for copies, but the officials refused. Lewis, thinking fast, played his final card: Naval Intelligence, the only group that had been listening to him. A call was made, and the Navy commander ordered the local lawmen to turn over the briefcase. As they drove to the naval base to make copies, Lewis ran through the names inside. James Cake Killer True, offering to procure rifles, General George Van Horn Mosley, and George Detheridge and Leslie Fry, who had instructed Henry Allen to purchase the Ku Klux Klan, lock, stock, and barrel. The Klan was to become a constituent unit of the American Nationalist Confederation, a new political and paramilitary organization with offices across the country, which had adopted as its symbol the Nazi swastika. The contents of the briefcase revealed a chilling convergence. The disparate threads of American extremism, the street-level thuggery of the silver shirts, the institutional rot of the Klan, and the ideological fervor of a new generation of Nazi sympathizers were being woven together into a single, unified national movement, preparing for a war that Leon Lewis and his small band of spies were now fighting almost entirely on their own. Chapter 9, probably 10 times more. On a cool day in February 1939, George Detheridge's heart might have skipped a beat as he sighted the flag flapping high atop Embassy Row in northwest Washington, D.C. The banner, with its bold red field, white circle, and black swastika, was already one of the most recognized symbols in the world. As it brought Germany out of the depths of despair, Detheridge had recently exclaimed to a rabid American audience, "So it will bring the United States." As he neared the turreted red brick German embassy, he entered a Nazi safe space, created not by German security, but by the U.S. Congress, which had recently cordoned off 500-foot protest-free zones around all foreign embassies. The law was a direct response to the simmering American feelings about the Nazis, though in the late 1930s, those feelings were still at a low boil. The Nazi annexation of Austria and the Sudetenland had failed to spawn major protests in Washington. The true test had come in November 1938, after a Polish Jewish teenager named Herschel Grinspan, filled with dark anxiety and wild despair over the persecution of his people, walked into the German embassy in Paris and shot a diplomat dead. The Nazis used the crime as a pretext to unleash Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. Across Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland, mobs laid waste to Jewish families, businesses, and synagogues. They murdered hundreds, looted millions of dollars worth of assets, and then, in a final act of perverse cruelty, levied a $400 million fine on the German Jewish community to cover the damages. Even after this harrowing news made front-page headlines in the United States, The area around the German embassy remained relatively calm. Fewer than 100 protesters showed up, and their 60-minute demonstration unfolded behind chalk-marked lines 500 feet from the building, proudly displaying its swastika flag. Their placards seemed feeble in the face of such terror. Resist fascist terror, boycott German goods. 3 months later, on a quiet day, George Detheridge stepped over those faded chalk lines and into the safe zone. A 45-year-old construction engineer and full-time political activist, Detheridge was a large and combative man who saw himself as a red-blooded patriot, a dedicated Christian, and a fierce protector of white Western civilization. In his benighted view, the commies were on the march, and the Jews were behind all of it. He was now waltzing into the German embassy, expecting an audience with his brothers in race and culture. Detheridge's arrival presented a problem, striking at an ideological conflict that split the embassy staff. German officials knew all about him. Just as they tracked intellectuals like Lawrence Dennis, they tracked ultra-right activists like Detheridge, who had been singled out in a 1937 report to Hitler as a key figure in the American fascist movement. But many in the embassy, long-serving professionals from the Foreign Office, wanted to steer clear of such rogue Americans. Their sworn duty was to keep the United States out of the coming war in Europe, and they knew that loud, unapologetic anti-Semites like Detheridge could antagonize the very middle-of-the-road Americans they needed to convince of the blessings of neutrality. There was, however, another faction in the embassy, one much more sanguine about men like Detheridge. These were the younger, more radical zealots from Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry, true believers in Hitler's messianic vision of a German race that does not cease at the frontiers of the Reich. One of these avowed acolytes was Baron Ulrich von Genandt, the new propaganda attaché. He understood that the first steps to omnipresent power required regional shock troops to sow a little chaos in their native lands. Having welcomed Lawrence Dennis to his home in Nuremberg, von Genandt now welcomed George Detheridge as an ally, and the two men sat down for a long and searching colloquy. Detheridge wasted no time bringing the German attaché up to speed. After years of fits and starts, the American fascist freight train was finally coupling its boxcars. Groups like the Silver Shirts, the German-American Bund, and the Knights of the White Camellia were falling in line under the swastika emblem of the American Nationalist Confederation, the organization whose plans Leon Lewis had discovered in Henry Allen's briefcase. All this train lacked, Detheridge explained, was an engine, a leader who could move the masses, an American Hitler. His first choice, Charles Lindbergh, had declined, but God had recently pointed him to the solution, Major General George Van Horn Moseley. Forcibly retired from the Army, Moseley was a ruthless, hard-right belligerent with real military command experience and close ties to other military men. He had recently gone on a tear against the Roosevelt administration, claiming the peril to America came from within. The genius of the radical right general was one of the few things all the American fascist leaders could agree on. Detheridge had already met with him on Armistice Day, just after Kristallnacht. The time was now, Detheridge told von Genandt, but the movement lacked resources. In a sophisticated but clear plea for money, he asked for advice. How had the Nazis survived the lean years before industry backed them? Von Genandt explained that they had starved, pooled their money, and peddled propaganda sheets. Then he offered a piece of encouragement. It looks to me, the German attaché said, that probably there is 10 times more anti-Semitism now in the United States than there was in Germany before Hitler's rise to power. It is not known if Detheridge relayed this advice to General Moseley, but it doesn't seem the general needed much prodding. In the aftermath of the embassy meeting, Moseley's rhetoric grew sharper. He would rile up audiences with a defense of the Second Amendment for patriotic Americans, not for communists, before ushering them into the home stretch of his oration, an anti-Semitic tirade featuring the big lie that an international Jewish cabal was bent on achieving communist rule in America. He used a cockfight analogy to argue for isolationism. Let the foreign nations expend their strength on each other, and then America can come in at the end and decide the fate of this funny old world. The ugly talk soon escalated. He called for a new immigration policy of selective breeding, including the sterilization of Jewish immigrants, and hinted at a liquidation of a very different order for his domestic enemies. To a Christian audience in Springfield, Illinois, he warned, "We can know definitely today that in due time we will be licked by some nation or group of nations that have looked to their manpower and bred it up." To which the American fascists hurrahed, "Hail Mosley!" With the encouragement of a sympathetic Nazi operative and the emergence of a decorated and ruthless military leader, the disparate elements of the American fascist movement had found their cause, their strategy, and their man. As Mosley prepared to take his political roadshow to the West Coast, the plan for a centralized paramilitary confederation was no longer a crackpot's fantasy captured in a stolen briefcase. It was an operational plan, led by a general who was now openly preparing for a violent final battle for the soul of the nation. Chapter 10, Bound and Obligated. Even the most consequential congressional hearings of the late 1930s were nothing like the televised spectacles of today. In hearing rooms that were neither august nor well-ordered, congressmen sat at one side of a large conference table, passing a single microphone among themselves, eye to eye with witnesses just a dozen feet away. Reporters and the public ringed this small pit, standing in corners or leaning against walls, as uniformed Capitol Police stood watch. In this intimate and inadequately lit setting, the House Committee on Un-American Activities, commonly called the Dies Committee, began its work. It was about as well funded as it appeared, which is to say not well at all, especially given the scope of its mandate, to investigate the extent and character of subversive propaganda in the United States. Constituted in the spring of 1938, the committee was a welcome development for American anti-communists. Its 7-man roster of Republicans and conservative Democrats opposed strikes, collective bargaining, and the New Deal, which they suspected was cooked up by socialist sympathizers. Their bullseye was the Communist Party of the United States of America. The threat, in their view, was not that the communists had become more revolutionary, but that they had become more palatable to the mainstream. Following Stalin's 1935 Popular Front policy, the CPUSA had begun to operate within the system, renouncing armed insurrection and publicly calling FDR the symbol which unites the broadest masses of the progressive majority. Membership nearly tripled, and its demographics shifted to native-born, English-speaking citizens who voted. The communists in America were not dangerous because they were planning an insurrection. They were dangerous because they were persuasive. This was the threat the Dies Committee was hot to investigate as its hearings kicked off in August 1938. But while the committee members were all eyes left, the damn proliferating fascists in America were making themselves difficult to ignore. A lot of information on the un-American activities of the far right was bleeding into public view, revealing a gathering swirl of hate that was about to come into direct, potentially violent confrontation with the U.S. government. On August 12th, the first witness called to testify on fascist organizing was John C. Metcalf, a former reporter who had gone undercover in the German-American Bund. Metcalf, who had a mad bent for danger, had become a right-hand man to the organization's leader, Fritz Kuhn. He was in the room when Kuhn boasted of his personal relationship with Adolf Hitler, and he brought to the committee a copy of a photograph of the two men, framed by swastikas, from the Bund yearbook. The caption read, "Bound to Germany, obligated to America." Metcalf submitted dozens of photos he had taken with a German-manufactured camera, hair-raising shots of Nazis at work and play in surreal summer outposts from Long Island to Los Angeles. He described American stormtrooper uniforms in technicolor detail and narrated photographs of them goose-stepping with Italian black shirts. He showed images of a flaming swastika ritual and, most chillingly, candid photos from Hitler youth camps. The uniformed girls might have been mistaken for campfire girls, but for the Hitler salutes and the swastikas. The boys, some wearing steel German helmets from World War I and posing with spears, were being thoroughly Hitlerized. The Bun's real purpose, Metcalf testified, was tied to the coming war in Europe, to establish a vast spy network and a powerful sabotage machine. He returned 3 months later to name names, calling out George Detheridge, William Dudley Pelley, James True, and Henry Allen, providing a letter from Allen that threatened more Jew corpses cluttering up American gutters than ever were found in the most ambitious of European pogroms. Metcalf was not alone. Just after the hearings began, Ken magazine published a remarkable expose uncovering a national scheme dreamed up by George Detheridge to unite all U.S. fascist groups under a swastika banner and to overthrow the American government. The plan was ambitious. A series of 13-man cells, operating in absolute secrecy, would procure mail-order guns through the National Rifle Association. After the 1940 election, they would unleash a burst of simultaneous, targeted violence across the country. In the ensuing chaos, they would seize power and install their preferred leader, an American Hitler. The story caught the eye of the Dies Committee, which called the magazine's editor, Arnold Gingrich, to testify. Gingrich was an articulate and informed witness. He handed the committee a Nazi propaganda pamphlet and then revealed the source for his reporting on Detheridge's plot, a series of confidential letters intended to be destroyed, which had been turned over to Navy intelligence in San Diego. The letters had come right out of Henry Allen's briefcase. There was a great hidden hand, after all, but it belonged to a superhero still in the shadows, Leon Lewis, the man who had laid the breadcrumbs right up to the barn door of fascist seditionists, found his intelligence leaked to the press without his approval. Lewis was wary. He had agents still undercover in dangerous positions. But the briefcase was a game changer, a treasure trove of evidence that should have been easy for law enforcement to follow. But nobody had. Certainly not J. Edgar Hoover's underprepared and overdressed FBI. Assistant Attorney General Brian McMahon tried to light a fire under Hoover in January 1939, suggesting a long list of ultra-right plots the Bureau might chase down, but the FBI director simply elided his requests, more concerned with possible communist influence in the Federal Writers Project. Maddeningly, memos would later reveal the FBI had been in possession of the Henry Allen briefcase file from Naval Intelligence for almost a year and had done nothing with it at all. When agents finally interviewed William Dudley Pelley in March 1939, they found him cooperative and did not press him for information. They had asserted in 1934, without looking into it, that the Silver Shirts had no ties to the Nazi government, and 5 years later, they still seemed uninterested in finding out if that was true. The FBI only began to look into George Detheridge after a local citizen in West Virginia waved the Ken article at them. Their investigation was marked pending for months and amounted to little more than a rehash of the magazine's findings. J. Edgar Hoover and his brain trust chose not to spend their dear resources investigating the fascist, Nazified alliance growing in America in 1939. And so the Dies Committee, under-resourced and usually looking in the wrong direction, remained the sole and therefore best government investigation into what was quickly becoming a real and violent fascist insurgency. The breadcrumbs had been laid, the alarm had been sounded in the halls of Congress, but the nation's premier law enforcement agency was willfully looking the other way, leaving a small band of secret agents and a flawed congressional committee as the only lines of defense against a homegrown plot to unravel the country from within. Chapter 11. The handwriting on the wall is clear as a bell. In the third week of May 1939, a strange duo appeared before the Dies Committee, peddling a conspiracy of epic proportions. The two witnesses, Dudley Pierpont Gilbert and James Campbell, claimed that a waiter at New York's elite Harmony Club had uncovered a plot by the nation's most prominent Jewish businessmen and politicians, including Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau and Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter to overthrow the U.S. government and install a Bolshevik regime. It was, in essence, the protocols of the elders of the Harmony Club, and it was just as credible as the original. Their evidence consisted of reports, codenamed music scores, that Gilbert had transcribed from the handwritten notes of the elusive waiter, George Rice, before burning the originals for safety's sake. Neither the waiter nor his real name could be produced. The witnesses quickly discredited themselves. Gilbert was exposed as a fascist who had been photographed giving the Sieg Heil salute and was being financially supported by his wife. Campbell was revealed as a racist who explained his habit of tearing return addresses off his mail because of a very inquisitive our janitor. This farcical testimony, however, led to something far more serious. The committee produced a letter showing that Campbell had been trafficking in anti-Semitic rumors, asking for research on the supposed Semitic connections of political figures. He had dutifully passed the questions on to an expert in such matters, George Detheridge. Detheridge's remarkable reply, dated December 14, 1938, was then entered into the record. "Our time is coming," Detheridge had written. "You may rest assured that the general will take care of that." The general, Campbell explained, was George Van Horn Mosley. Detheridge's letter detailed a plan for military action to get this gang out, with Mosley deciding the procedure. "Now, we must have state and county leaders all over the nation that we know without a shadow of a doubt are men that will stick under any kind of fire," he continued, adding that he felt sure that active military officers would resign their commissions and enlist with us for this American Jewish war. The letter's entry into the record was an explosive moment. By noon the next day, Chairman Dyes had sent subpoenas to both Detheridge and General Mosley. Detheridge, demanding a public hearing, arrived tout de suite and came out swinging. He clashed with the chairman even before being sworn in, wanting assurance that his oath was a Christian oath. He then slalomed through an account of his life and his organizations, proudly claiming his connection to the feuding Hatfields of West Virginia and his friendship with James True, the inventor of the kite killer. The weapon, he explained with a straight face, was a baton that came in ladies' and gentlemen's sizes, a comment that drew laughter from the room. He explained his political method, to appeal to people's emotions, not their reason. "That is what Hitler said in Mein Kampf," Dyes noted. "I don't know whether he said it or not," Detheridge replied, "but that is what I said." He conceded he was bigoted enough to believe in white supremacy in the South, a remark the committee allowed to pass without objection. He was perturbed only that he was not given the chance to present his 2 tons of alphabetized charts and documents detailing the vast international Jewish communist web, which he claimed he could have trucked in on 5 minutes' notice. General Mosley arrived a week later, after telling the press he was the victim of a smearing campaign. His testimony began with a piece of theater. Pointing to his drinking glass, he asked the committee counsel to guarantee the water supply. Before anyone could answer, one of his factotums grabbed the glass, dramatically dumped its contents into a spittoon, and returned with a fresh cup, later telling a reporter he was absolutely afraid the water had been contaminated. Mosley explained his uneasiness. "A lot of people have dropped out of the way in the last few years, very quietly." Here he sat, a decorated general, summoned as a hostile witness to answer for his political activities. "All I am trying to do," he declared, "is save America from herself." He admitted his close association with Campbell and his daily meetings with Detheridge, whom he described as a two-fisted, honest patriot. He laid out his worldview with chilling clarity. Communism was the disease ravaging America, and the Nazi and fascist organizations were the antitoxin. His frustration was palpable. He sputtered, the handwriting on the wall as clear as a bell, blaming the White House for hamstringing the army in its fight against the enemy within our gates. He spoke of his admiration for Hitler, who he claimed had solved Germany's problem of international finance and had solved the racial problem. When pressed, he would not disapprove of Hitler's methods. "I approve of his taking back and placing in the hands of the German people the control of that nation," he said. The farcical conspiracy theory of the Harmony Club had led the committee down a dark path, right to the feet of a retired American general who now sat before them under oath, calmly confirming his leadership of a nascent fascist insurrection and his alignment with the tyrants of Europe. The handwriting was indeed on the wall, and it was his own. The journey that began with Philip Johnson's youthful fantasies at a Nazi rally had now reached the halls of the U.S. Congress, where the incoherent theories of American fascists had coalesced into a tangible threat, articulated not by a fringe pamphleteer, but by a man who had commanded American armies. The scattered plots and localized hatreds, once dismissed as the work of crackpots and thugs, had found their voice in their leader, transforming the specter of an American Hitler from a dark dream into a clear and present danger. Chapter 12, Hollywood. On the evening of April 27, 1939, studio mogul Louis B. Mayer threw a party, broadcasting it live on a coast-to-coast radio program. The occasion, as announced by one of MGM's top players, was an elaborate banquet to toast one of the greatest, most beloved American actors, Lionel Barrymore, on the eve of his 61st birthday. The pretext was thin. Barrymore's star was waning, and the eve of a 61st birthday is hardly a landmark. But Mr. Mayer, arguably the most powerful man in one of America's most lucrative industries, had decided the event needed to be marked. And when Mr. Mayer decided something, the entire MGM family toed the line. Attendance was mandatory for every marquee name, every major executive, every senior director on the payroll. And so, on an MGM soundstage, amid a thrilling spectacle of red, white, and blue decorations, megastars like William Powell, Myrna Loy, Mickey Rooney, and Clark Gable gathered to recite lines from an execrable poem and pay tribute to their fellow contract player. Mayer himself gave the keynote, using it to plug Barrymore's latest film. In his less than 2 minutes of airtime, Barrymore offered a word about the troubled world and the great motion picture industry which brings a troubled world entertainment through which escape from cares may be found. This troubled world was exactly what was behind Mayer's decision to gather the jewels of the MGM crown under his watchful eye. The purported celebration was less important than the date. On that same spring evening, just a few miles north, a rival studio was premiering a film that Mayer feared would do much harm to the reputation and commercial health of the industry he bestrode, and maybe even to the physical safety of its stars. He had not forbidden his employees from attending the premiere at the Warner Bros. Beverly Hills Theater. He had simply made sure they were otherwise engaged. All of them. Mr. Mayer was protecting the brand. While 1939 is remembered as the greatest year of Hollywood cinema for films like The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind, the production that roiled the industry like no other, the one that so worried Louis B. Mayer, was one very few living Americans could name today: Confessions of a Nazi Spy. The premiere was a tense affair. Warner Bros. Had hired hundreds of plainclothes security guards to ring the theater, on the lookout for saboteurs. The LAPD was so concerned that they posted a team of police snipers on the roof of the gleaming cinema. Mayer wanted none of his people anywhere near this Miss Hagas. The Warners, he and his fellow studio execs felt, were playing a dangerous game. The film was a ripped-from-the-headline story of a Nazi spy ring that had been prosecuted in the U.S. just months earlier. The espionage plot went all the way to the top of the Nazi government, implicating Goering, Goebbels, and Hitler himself. The studio had bought the rights while the trial was still underway. Jack and Harry Warner, Jewish immigrants from Poland, already knew plenty about the Nazis and their network in America. Along with Mayer, they had been financial backers of Leon Lewis's secret investigative work. But where they had once preferred to fight behind the scenes, keeping their politics out of their films, by 1939 they found themselves on a different path. They expected and got insurmountable pushback from the Production Code Administration, the industry's censor, which was run by the notorious anti-Semite Joseph Breen. A PCA reader recommended halting the film, calling it an unwelcome departure from the pleasant and profitable course of entertainment to engage in propaganda. The report was even more stunning in its assessment of the film's villain. To represent Hitler only as a screaming madman and a bloodthirsty persecutor, the censor wrote, is manifestly unfair, considering his phenomenal public career, his unchallenged political and social achievements, and his position as head of the most important continental European power. The Warners decided to dig in and fight. The production was fraught. Actors turned down parts, fearing reprisals. During filming, a 60-pound piece of equipment fell from a sound boom and barely missed the star, Edward G. Robinson, in an incident later pronounced to be sabotage. But the Warners persevered, and after reluctantly signing off, the PCA allowed the film to be released. The premiere, one studio executive said, was a bar mitzvah for the entire industry. Motion picture came of age. It said, "Today, I am a man." After its sniper-protected Hollywood debut, the film had a month-long rolling open across the country, and its impact was proof of the power of Hollywood. More than news, more than investigations, more than congressional hearings, the movie had a huge effect on public awareness, marking the moment when millions of Americans began to realize the full enormity of what was happening in Europe. Much of the film was John C. Metcalf's Dies Committee testimony come to life. Nazi propaganda being offloaded at U.S. ports, swastika-branded pamphlets dropping from biplanes, and armed and uniformed American boys and girls in Hitler youth camps. It rang loud, melodramatic alarms about Hitler's machinations inside the United States. And yet, for all its truth-telling, there was one striking omission insisted upon by the PCA. The words Jew and Jewish were never uttered. Hitler and company were still the bad guys, but the censors had scrubbed their signature big lie, that the Jewish people were to blame, from the story. The German government demanded the film be banned. Pro-Nazi Americans picketed and vandalized theaters, but most theater owners were undeterred. The film's Washington, D.C. premiere happened to fall in the brief interval between the testimonies of George Deatherage and General Moseley, and it did a better job of conveying the Nazi threat than the live testimony on Capitol Hill. The film's depiction of the FBI, however, underplayed the color and suspense of the real story. The agent who actually broke the case was Leon Turu, a Belarusian Jewish immigrant who, after the indictments, announced his retirement from the Bureau to write an exclusive newspaper series. An enraged J. Edgar Hoover, jealous of the attention and protective of his own side business of selling FBI stories, retroactively fired Turu with prejudice, ensuring he would lose his pension and be blackballed from law enforcement for life. But for all that, Hoover couldn't stop the movie. Confessions of a Nazi spy broke the seal, and soon every studio in town had an anti-Nazi picture in the works. The FBI, which had studiously ignored the fascist threat, received a windfall of public credit it had not earned. The film's national run had just wound down in the late summer of 1939 when a railroad clerk and part-time National Guard machine gun specialist named Dennis Healy walked into the FBI's New York office. He had been invited to join a group of fascist militants called the Christian Front. They wanted him to steal machine guns. The whole thing seemed a little far-fetched, but the new agent in charge, perhaps thinking of the fame and fortune that had come to his former colleague Leon Turu, decided to play it out. A few days later, 2 agents trailed Healy to a meeting of the organization in Brooklyn. He wasn't bullshitting. Healy was introduced as a future machine gunner for the Christian Front. Then, amid a roar of wild applause, a young local man who had just been appointed its head strutted to the platform. It was apparent from the moment he started talking that John Cassidy and his group were worth watching. Chapter 13, Country Gentleman. John F. Cassidy was not entirely a Brooklyn native, had applied for a job as a special agent, but after noting his waxed mustache and twice-failed bar exam, the Bureau's report was unkind. Insipid personality, limited ability, lacking in initiative. But a man's qualifications are often in the eye of the beholder. 3 years later, when Cassidy presented himself to Father Charles Coughlin, America's most famous clergyman saw a devout Catholic, demonstrably committed to God and country, and happily arranged a leadership role for the young man. By 1938, Coughlin was more convinced than ever of a sinister Jewish commie Bolshevist conspiracy destroying America, a message he spelled out in gruesome detail to his 30 million radio listeners each Sunday. Time was getting short, and the time for action, real action by real Christians, was near. For Cassidy, who had failed the bar exam 3 more times and was still unable to practice law, the crusade gave him a new sense of purpose. Coughlin, too, was in need of a new purpose. His 1936 third-party presidential campaign, boisterous rallies, and Philip Johnson's Nazi-inspired platform notwithstanding, had flopped. He had promised 9 million votes and delivered less than 1. His vague accusations against internationalist bankers had failed to get the traction he desired. So, after the election, Coughlin made a mean political calculation and turned to a more readily identifiable villain. From that point forward, says historian Charles R. Gallagher, the grievance claims that he manufactures are going to be more and more about Jews. By the summer of 1938, Coughlin was all in on explicit anti-Semitism, following Henry Ford's example by serializing the despicable protocols of the Elders of Zion in his magazine, Social Justice. He constructed a symbiotic link between Judaism and communism, telling his audience that both Marx and Lenin were Jews and that their ideology was an existential threat to Christianity itself. In the days after Kristallnacht, he gave a radio sermon blaming the Jews of Germany for bringing the violence upon themselves through their aggressiveness, and he defended Nazism as merely a defense mechanism against communism. When Coughlin's New York radio affiliate, WMCA, horrified, demanded to review his sermons in advance, the priest's followers immediately mobilized. A letter from the duly appointed representatives of the Christian Front charged the station with violating Coughlin's right to free speech. The next Sunday, 2,000 Christian Fronters began picketing the station, a demonstration they would continue for 38 straight weeks. For true believers like John F. Cassidy, who joined the picket lines, the attacks on Coughlin's rights confirmed his wildest claims. Communism in America has formerly been a battle of words, Cassidy said, but now has become a battle of militant action. As Cassidy angled for a leadership role, Coughlin breathed real fire into the organization, calling for an offensive plan and invoking the recent fascist victory in Spain. "The Christian way is the peaceful way until all arguments have failed," Coughlin exclaimed. "There is left no other way but the way of defending ourselves, Franco's way, the way of the gun." He began calling President Roosevelt a tyrant, a move that, grounded in the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas, gave his followers moral and theological permission to remove the leader by force. A believer in every sense, theologically, politically, militantly, the 28-year-old Cassidy traveled to Detroit and was anointed by Coughlin as a leader of the Christian Front. "All I am waiting for is the signal to go," Cassidy wrote to the priest after receiving his benediction. "I shall never let up until the enemy quits or is beaten." By the summer of 1939, the revolutionary temperature in New York City was rising. A splinter group leader, Joe McWilliams, held violent Buy Christian rallies and hosted menacing clubhouse meetings where axe handles and lead pipes lined the walls. "We are going to run this country with an iron hand, the way Hitler runs Germany," he told his boyos. A massive rally in the Bronx featured uniformed members of the German-American Bund and swastika-festooned soldiers of the American Nationalist Confederation. George Detheridge, subbing for the absent General Moseley, delivered a stem winder, vowing to walk ahead of Christ with a club, and quoting his German embassy pal, von Genandt, "Anti-Semitism in America was 10 times more powerful than existed in pre-Hitler Germany." Then, on September 1st, 1939, the world was jolted by Germany's invasion of Poland. Men like Coughlin and Cassidy were electrified. For Philip Johnson, reporting from a cafe in Munich for Social Justice, the news was too good to be true. He filed glowing reports of the contented new citizens of the Third Reich, assuring readers that Hitler would make a damn fine ally in the existential fight between Christians and communists. This was the precise moment that Dennis Healy, a full-time railroad man and part-time National Guard machine gunner, began his journey into the inner circle of the Christian Front, with the FBI looking over his shoulder. The Bureau wired his house, and in a mid-September meeting, Healy's recruiter, Klaus Gunther Ernecke, told him about a special faction called the Country Gentlemen, organized into cells, preparing for the inevitable revolution. Ernecke was earnest about their mission, to eradicate the Jews. "We lose. We're dead," he told Healy. "We win. We control the country." A week later, Healy met the military supervisor, William Gerald Bishop, a mysterious tough man who claimed to have fought alongside Franco and to be an agent for Hitler. Healy's cell with Cassidy, the little Führer, often in attendance, took a field trip for target practice. FBI agents followed, camouflaging themselves in the woods and filming the men as they fired military-grade rifles at effigies of President Roosevelt. When Congress repealed the Neutrality Act a few weeks later, the incensed Cassidy threatened to knock off a dozen congressmen just to show them that the Christian Front means business. Things began moving at a disorienting speed. Bishop boasted of receiving stolen Browning machine guns and ammunition from a captain in the New York National Guard. Shortly before Christmas 1939, he showed Healy a cache of 7,000 rounds of ammunition and several fully loaded machine gun belts, explaining how easily he had obtained them. He was also given cordite for bombs. The plan was for the Country Gentlemen to hurl explosives into a theater and the offices of two newspapers, the Jewish Daily Forward and the Daily Worker. This was to be the first move in a multi-step accelerationist strategy. The bombings were designed to incite the Jews and communists to riot, provoking a response from the National Guard and police. The Christian fronters would then join the fight, wearing trademark caps so they could be recognized by the authorities as brothers in arms. They were still counting on General Moseley to take the reins as America's new military dictator once the coup was complete. Historians and contemporary reporters generally dismissed the Christian Front episode as insignificant, a playful plot carried out by crackpots. But when historian Charles Gallagher became the first to obtain the FBI's case file on the group, he discovered something entirely different. These religious crusaders were not only determined to carry out their mission, they had real support inside the National Guard and the NYPD. More than 400 cops later voluntarily admitted membership. The FBI photographs from the firing range in Narrowsburg, New York, shocked Gallagher. "The journalists at the time didn't see it, but I knew what they were holding," he says. "They looked like weapons of war to me. One of those bullets can go through a brick wall. These folks were armed for war." There was even good evidence that Bishop had obtained 2 Browning light machine guns, one of the most lethal and brilliantly engineered automatic weapons of its time, a weapon that could obliterate anything in its path. The playful plot was anything but. It was a deadly serious plan for a violent insurrection, orchestrated by a popular religious leader, led by a devotee waiting for the signal to go, and armed with some of the most lethal weapons of modern warfare. Chapter 14, Small World. The role of Christian martyr fit John F. Cassidy like a pontifical glove. In the year of our Lord, 1940, the anointed leader of the Christian Front was arrested, and he appeared to relish his place in the very public political drama that followed. One day after his arrest, Cassidy and 16 co-defendants were rousted from their holding cells and taken to be arraigned. The spectacle, as Cassidy would recall it decades later, was a show staged by J. Edgar Hoover himself, a screaming motorcade through downtown Manhattan with a truck full of special agents pointing machine guns from the West Side Highway. "What a lot of nonsense," he called it. The defendants themselves did not cut particularly dashing figures. The New York Times described the motley crew of chauffeurs, tailors, and telephone linemen as more frightened than revolutionary. But Hoover insisted he had good reason to put them under heavy guard. At the time of their arrest, they had in their possession 15 partly completed bombs, military-grade rifles, 4,000 rounds of ammunition, and a long sword. The FBI had disrupted only one of the front's paramilitary cells and believed the number of members in New York alone was in the thousands. Remember, Hoover told reporters, it took only 23 men to overthrow Russia. This group, Hoover explained, was set for imminent action. Their plan was to bring about a complete eradication of all Jews, seize all public utilities, and set up a dictatorship similar to Hitler's. The men were charged with sedition. Hoover named William Gerald Bishop and John F. Cassidy as the ringleaders and hinted at their close ties to Father Charles Coughlin, the most powerful right-wing media figure in the country. Coughlin's first instinct was to cover his own Christian rear end, issuing a public statement disavowing the group and claiming, in a demonstrable lie, that he had recently returned a $1,000 check to them. His strenuous disavowal seemed safe, as the initial public reaction to the arrests was dismissive. New York's Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia reportedly laughed at the news, and one congressman called it a crackpot conspiracy. But the defendants played to a different audience. Bishop told reporters he was wearing a crucifix blessed by Father Coughlin. Cassidy, who had a snapshot of William Dudley Pelley in his wallet, was passing time in the holding tank saying the rosary. "I'm not guilty of anything but Christian American self-defense," he told reporters. "Long live Christ the King! Down with communism!" Coughlin could feel the winds turning. In his first Sunday sermon after the arrests, he tacked his vessel, telling his 30 million listeners that while he did not belong to any unit of the Christian front, "I do not disassociate myself from that movement." He reaffirmed his call for its formation and declared his decision to stand by Cassidy and the others. An entire flotilla of isolationists and anti-communists fell into his wake, with one congressman calling the case a childish attempt to shield the communists. The Roosevelt administration, however, was making no apologies. The president himself sent a memo to the new Attorney General, Robert Jackson, making the prosecution of Cassidy and Co. a priority. Jackson scrambled the head of the DOJ's criminal division, O. John Rogge, to oversee the case. A conviction on seditious conspiracy was a tall order. Hoover himself knew that bragging about overthrowing the government in a bar wasn't enough to prove an overt act. The charge of theft of government property, however, seemed unassailable, given the motherlode of bombs, ammunition, and machine gun belts seized from the defendants' homes. But even that case got wobbly when the trail for 2 stolen Browning automatic rifles led to a National Guard armory in Massachusetts, where a wall of silence went up. Everybody clammed up, as one historian would later put it. Without the military admitting the theft, it was going to be hard to prosecute. The trial commenced in April 1940 in a circus atmosphere. The judge limited access to the courtroom, but the madness spilled outside, where supporters shouted, "Down with the Reds," and enterprising Coughlinites sold the latest issue of Social Justice. Even the jury selection devolved into a blistering examination. The defense proved adept at knocking off anyone with a whiff of commie and successfully implied that the prosecutors were prejudiced against Catholics. The woman finally selected as foreperson was a middle-aged Brooklyn housewife. The prosecutors, alas, had failed to ascertain that she was related by marriage to the lead defense attorney. The government's case rested on its star witness, the FBI informant Dennis Healy. For 6 days, he sat on the stand, reading from a tattered notebook and detailing the entire plot. But the cross-examination was withering. The defense painted him as a liar, an agent provocateur, and worst of all, a paid snitch. The most damning label in the Irish Catholic culture of Brooklyn. 5 days in, Healy collapsed and was taken to the hospital. The next day, the defendant who had first recruited him, Klaus Ernecke, was found hanged in a Brooklyn cellar. When Healy returned, his credibility was further shattered by the confusing mystery of his own personal history. As Healy's testimony went south, a parade of FBI agents appeared to save the day, corroborating his story with verbatim quotes from their wiretaps, surveillance footage of the target practice, and cartons full of jerry-rigged bombs. The trial went on for 10 uninterrupted weeks, and as it did, Hitler's blitzkrieg roared across Western Europe. Americans, however, were still hoping someone else would handle it. A Gallup poll found the country more than 13-1 against entering the conflict. The defense made a rousing final argument that was perfectly tailored to its audience. Sure, one of the defendants wanted to shoot a few communists, the lead lawyer explained. So would I, and so would a lot of other Americans. But just because you'd like to do something, he argued, doesn't mean you're going to do it. The jury hung on the four main defendants, including Bishop. The bloody DOJ decided not to pursue another trial, so they walked. The other defendants, including John F. Cassidy, were flat out acquitted. When the verdict was announced, the courthouse corridors erupted in cheers. Cassidy walked right up to the judge and demanded the return of all the guns. Coughlin released a statement calling the conspiracy a hoax and warning that now the Jews were really going to get it. At a rally a few days later celebrating the Brooklyn Boys, a local priest, sometimes called the philosopher of the Christian Front, let the audience in on a secret. The jury foreman, Mrs. Helen Titus? You may be interested to know, he said, that she is my first cousin. Huh, small world. Then one of the exonerated defendants, Macklin Butker, was invited to speak, and he let the audience in on another little courtroom secret. At least 10 members of our jury, he told the cheering crowd, are going to apply for membership in the Christian Front. The plot to overthrow the government had failed in its execution, but in a Brooklyn courtroom, its core ideology had been thoroughly, devastatingly vindicated. Chapter 15. Trip 19. On the morning of August 31st, 1940, the start of the long Labor Day weekend, the sun dappled angry. As Dorothy Everhart stepped out of her farmhouse, she could smell the brewing storm. Then she saw it, a bright silver airplane, flying just below the cloud ceiling, unwavering in its path, heading right into the line of approaching rainfall. A brilliant spark of lightning flashed, momentarily blinding her. She lost sight of the plane, then heard a low rumble of thunder, followed seconds later by an awful roaring that she was sure came from the airplane. Other witnesses heard it too, an awful racket, like a sudden frightened acceleration of the engines. Then an explosion that almost knocked one woman off her feet. After the explosion, an eerie silence. And then a torrent of rain swept across the town. Over the next 20 minutes, strange pieces of airborne flotsam, a singed manila envelope, passenger manifests, a cardboard sign that read, "Sorry, this seat is occupied," floated down from the sky. The question was, did any of those passengers survive? When the first locals reached the scene, it was immediately apparent there would be no one to nurse. The Douglas DC-3 airplane had struck the ground at the edge of an alfalfa field at a speed of more than 300 miles per hour and at an angle almost straight down. The nose had plowed 6 feet into the rain-softened earth. The rest of the wreckage, landing gear, wings, the passenger cabin, had hurtled forward, scattering debris for nearly 2,000 feet. But the sight of the smoldering machine was nothing compared to the sight of the human debris. There were 21 passengers and 4 crew members on the plane, and definitely no survivors. The bodies had been pitched ahead as if shot from a cannon, some cut in half by their still-fastened seat belts. We walked through this cornfield, and parts of bodies were strung along the cornstalks. One witness, just 12 years old at the time, would recall decades later. Shoes neatly tied sat in the field with feet still in them, separated from the bodies of the people on the plane, said a former federal prosecutor who later investigated the crash. The dive into the ground was so dramatic that there were pieces of people all over the area. As the difficult process of identification began the next day, the press already had the names of the dead. Most were government workers from Washington, where the flight had originated. But what made this disaster, until that date, the single deadliest airline crash in U.S. history, especially big news, was the presence on the manifest of U.S. Senator Ernest Lundeen of Minnesota. Flags were set at half-mast in the nation's capital, but the tributes were more a trickle than a flood. His colleagues offered vague platitudes, and a home state newspaper delicately noted his legendary contrariness. The 62-year-old senator had spent his career staking out strange positions. As a first-term congressman in 1917, he had been a paid contributor to a pro-German, anti-interventionist magazine secretly funded by the German government. He refused to support the war effort in World War I, becoming an almost unpatriotic figure, and was once literally run out of a Minnesota town on a rail for his foreign policy remarks. He returned to Congress in the 1930s, his hardline isolationist rhetoric unchanged. In the summer of 1940, he had thrown himself like a monkey wrench into President Roosevelt's preparations for a possible war, fighting the military draft bill as nothing short of slavery, and railing against the administration's total defense package just the day before he stepped onto that ill-fated flight. The Civil Aeronautics Board investigation produced no definite answers. The plane was safe, the pilots experienced, the maintenance up to date. Experts dismissed the lightning strike theory. But there was one undeniable fact. The plane's engines were at wide open full throttle when it slammed into the ground. The board's conclusion was as tantalizing as it was vague. It is possible that for some reason the pilot and co-pilot were prevented from effectively operating the controls. The question remained, prevented by what? The renowned political columnist Drew Pearson thought he might be onto something. In the aftermath of the crash, Senator Lundine's decidedly unhappy office staff was ready to spill. They were sorely tested, not only by the senator's petty greed. He ran a kickback scheme, forcing them to hand over a portion of their meager salaries in cash, but by his increasingly dangerous political associations. One aide told the FBI that on the morning of his fatal flight, a distraught Lundine had cryptically confided to her, "I've gone too far to turn back." Another staffer, Phyllis Pozivio, recounted a memorable visit from the senator's widow just 2 days after the crash. More anxious than distraught, Norma Lundine made an odd request. She wanted every piece of correspondence between her husband and George Sylvester Viereck, the infamous German propagandist. Viereck, Pozivio knew, had been a mainstay in the office, using it as a base of operations to lobby Congress. Norma Lundine took the Viereck file and left. Lundine's former top aide, Edward Corneby, had been warning the senator about his involvement with Viereck for months. After the crash, he filled Pearson in. 2 weeks later, Pearson published his exclusive scoop. If federal authorities probe deep enough into the crash, they may find some highly interesting facts regarding Nazi activities in the United States, was the lead. Pearson reported that the FBI already had an open investigation into the senator's mysterious visits from Viereck, and that at least one of the Justice Department employees on the plane was definitely tailing the senator. Suddenly, Norma Lundine's race across the country to secure the Viereck file took on a new cast. The story of Trip 19 was no longer just a tragic accident. It was a mystery entangled in a web of espionage, whispers of sabotage, and the compromised loyalties of a United States senator, all coming to a violent end in a Virginia cornfield. Chapter 16, Promiscuous Use of His Frank. In the last week of August 1940, just days before Senator Ernest Lundine's plane went down, a bland-looking, middle-aged man testified before the Dies Committee. Henry Hoke, a respected advertising man from New York, cut an entirely unalarming figure, but his testimony belied his looks. A dangerous tide, he insisted, was surging into America from Europe, and the country seemed powerless to stanch it. The committee's investigators, wary of this man who had inundated them with reams of evidence of German agents operating in the U.S. government, questioned his motives. Was he being paid by any Jewish organization? No, Hoke answered, unperturbed. His crusade, he explained, had begun the previous September, after his freshman son at the University of Pennsylvania complained of being annoyed by propaganda slips shoved under his dorm room door each morning. They all had a simple, direct theme. Keep America out of Europe's war. Leave Hitler alone. Hoke, an expert in direct mail, knew hard-sell propaganda when he saw it. He started digging. He learned that similar pamphlets were appearing at colleges all over New England and the Midwest, and that local clergymen were receiving a mailing called Facts in Review from something called the German Library of Information. Over the next 6 months, he collected a vast amount of slick, state-of-the-art pro-Nazi, isolationist literature. He was shaken by the sophistication of what was clearly a well-financed German campaign. Over the objections of colleagues who warned that politics could be bad for business, Hoke published a stunning expose in his trade magazine, The Reporter of Direct Mail Advertising. The May 1940 article, War in the Mails, laid out the evidence. A massive, Berlin-funded propaganda campaign was flooding the United States, reaching millions of Americans. Hoke identified the front organizations and their output. The German Library of Information was mailing nearly 100,000 copies of its weekly digest, Facts in Review, to American influencers, framing Germany as the victim. A similar bulletin went out to 40,000 U.S. bankers and stockbrokers. A German-funded group, the American Fellowship Forum, was sponsoring speaking tours and a new magazine, Today's Challenge, featuring articles by Lawrence Dennis, Senator Ernest Lundin, and Philip Johnson. The Nazis' plain intent, Hoke explained, was to add stress to the cracks already visible in American life: rich versus poor, Gentile versus Jew. Hoke sent his article to the Postmaster General, asking for an investigation, but postal inspectors told him it was not actually against any existing law. Soon after, he received a threatening letter from the head of the German Railroad's information office, demanding a retraction. Hoke refused, and as word of his crusade spread, other private citizens began sending him the Nazi propaganda they were receiving. Hoke's appearance before the Dies Committee gave him a chance to present his evidence to Congress. He explained how an international postal treaty meant U.S. taxpayers were unwillingly subsidizing the delivery of German propaganda from overseas. But just as Leon Lewis had discovered in California, Congress was tied in partisan knots. The post office was powerless, and the FBI and DOJ, still smarting from the Christian Front embarrassment, were not looking for another fight with the far right. Hoke continued his lonely crusade, paying particular attention to the language used by both German propagandists and American isolationists, like Senator Burton K. Wheeler. He noticed Wheeler's name kept showing up on Nazi-friendly mailings. Running forensics on envelopes bearing Wheeler's signature as the return address, Hoke and his team made an intriguing discovery. The addressing had been done by a peculiar, old-fashioned Elliott addressing machine. In a move straight out of a detective story, they tracked one of only 3 such extant machines to the New York offices of the Steuben Society, a Nazi apologist organization with quiet support from the German Foreign Office. Confidential bulletins from the society offered reprints of speeches by Senator Wheeler in franked envelopes, with no postage required. The peculiar addressing style and the old-fashioned blue ink matched. After nearly 18 months of investigation, Hoke had found his definite proof. Senator Wheeler was allowing a German organization to make promiscuous use of his franc. The franking privilege, a free mail allowance for members of Congress, had become a loophole through which the German government could pump propaganda into the United States at taxpayer expense. Hoke followed the clues. Unaddressed franked envelopes under the signatures of Wheeler and other isolationist congressmen had been given to the America First Committee, the German-American Bund, and raging anti-Semites like Joe McWilliams and the Henry Ford-funded Elizabeth Dilling. These spiders would stuff the envelopes with pro-German propaganda, fill in the addresses from any mailing list they could get their hands on, and send them out, postage paid by the taxpayer. By the spring of 1941, Hoke was feeling a sense of urgency. The America First Committee was now the biggest and most influential political organization in the country, and growing fast. Its rallies drew massive crowds, headlined by Charles Lindbergh and Senator Wheeler. The threads of isolationism, anti-Semitism, and fascism were becoming an ominously tight weave. In a speech that summer, Lindbergh sloughed off all ambiguity, naming the British, the Jewish, and the Roosevelt administration as the groups pressing for war and making a barely tacit threat that America's tolerance for Jews would end if war began. Hoke identified 20 representatives and senators who were letting pro-Nazi groups use their franking privilege. When the news got out, Wheeler and Congressman Hamilton Fish feigned outrage. Secretary of War Henry Stimson was appalled, calling Wheeler's actions very near the line of subversive activities, if not treason. But Hoke, working from the outside, was still trying to prove his hunch that there was a central master headquarters coordinating the entire operation. His feeling was never stronger than at the end of the summer of 1941, when a federal official told him about a strange happening at a recent Washington cocktail party. One of the guests, a congressional aide, in his cups, had blurted out that there was a hell of a lot more to the franking scandal than anyone really knew. "If I ever told my story," the aide had confided, "it would blow the dome off the Capitol." The story of the American fascist movement had now moved from the violent fringes and into the very heart of the nation's government. The lonely investigations of men like Leon Lewis and Henry Hoke had followed the trail of sedition from street-level thugs and crackpot prophets all the way to the mailboxes of the U.S. Congress, revealing a conspiracy that was not just about ideology, but about the corruption of the democratic process itself, with the quiet complicity of elected American officials. Chapter 17. I'm not supposed to be doing this kind of... Stokes followed the truck. It bypassed the federal courthouse, continued southeast, and turned into an alley where the driver dropped off a dozen mail bags. He then headed to the other side of Capitol Hill and hauled the remaining bags into a building that housed congressional offices. Stokes didn't know what was in the bags, but he knew they hadn't been delivered to the grand jury, and he had a feeling he'd found the lever to crack open the story. Within a week, the mystery began to unravel. The grand jury heard from the House Post Office, the truck driver, and a secretary from the D.C. headquarters of the America First Committee, the location of the first drop-off. Investigators then dragged 10 mail bags from the America First office and found them filled with unaddressed envelopes, bearing the franks of members of Congress and stuffed with German-friendly treatises ready for free shipment. Stokes, meanwhile, was naming names in the Post. The headliner was the powerful Republican Congressman Hamilton Fish. When confronted with hard evidence that the mail truck had been sent to the apartment on orders from his office, Fish had an explanation ready. It was all the doing of the fellow living there, Prescott Dennett, the same press agent who had worked for the late Senator Ernest Lundeen. Fish claimed a casual acquaintance had led to his aide sending the truck. He insisted he was not personally involved. Too bad for Fish. Stokes soon discovered that some of the unaccounted-for mail bags were sitting in the congressman's official storage space in the new House office building. Stokes raced to the storeroom and found 8 full-sized mail bags. His splashy front-page story in the Post included a photograph of him examining the contents, anti-Roosevelt speeches, and franked envelopes from at least a dozen members of Congress, including one bearing the signature of Ernest Lundeen, who had been dead for a year. One bag was tagged, "Kong, Fish, attention, Mr. Hill." Fish went to the floor of the House to decry the story as contemptible, dastardly, and lying. Stokes answered the next day with a deliciously detailed account of how Dennett, upon receiving his grand jury subpoena, had immediately called Fish's secretary, George Hill, who had then demanded a truck be sent to pick up some things. The young truck driver, rankled when a neighbor complained about the noise, had been heard to say, "I'm not supposed to be doing this kind of work anyway." That same weekend, Senator Burton Wheeler arrived in Los Angeles for a week of isolationist rallies, promising an investigation into the anti-German Hollywood studios. His activities were well covered thanks to Leon Lewis and his undercover spies, who for 8 years had been hunting and cataloging Nazi-friendly Angelenos. Their weekly broadsheet, the newsletter, identified dozens of German agents and leading anti-Semites in attendance at Wheeler's speeches. Back in Washington, the pressure was mounting. Prosecutor Maloney summoned the known German agent George Sylvester Viereck to the witness box. Viereck was soon indicted for falsifying his role, and the indictment spelled out his connection to Prescott Dennett and the late Senator Lundeen. No wonder Lundeen's widow had been so eager to collect her husband's correspondence. Next came Fish's staffer, George Hill, who falsely swore under oath that he had no connection to Viereck. Late one night in October, acting on another good tip, Dillard Stokes witnessed an America First employee burning a pile of mail in an alley. He rushed in, pulled the charred but still legible fragments from the trash can, and delivered the still warm evidence to the DOJ. The next afternoon, George Hill was indicted for his role in the cover-up. According to prosecutors, he was the person Henry Hoke had been looking for, the key man of a propaganda machine masterminded by German agents. When Congressman Fish was finally summoned to appear before the grand jury, he went to the floor of the House and begged his colleagues to formally instruct him not to comply, citing congressional privilege. By the time the House clarified that he could, in fact, appear, Fish had left town for reserve army training. "They can't subpoena me while I'm in the army," he harumphed to a reporter on his way out of town. The trail of sedition had led from a lonely reporter's stakeout to the highest levels of the U.S. government, exposing a conspiracy that had now been followed all the way to its source. The key man Hoke had been searching for was in custody, and his boss, a powerful United States congressman, was quite literally running for cover,